Today is All Saints' Day, special day to occur on a Sunday. The word saint is used to translate a couple of words. In the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, it's used to translate the word hasid, which meant pure, and we understand that from the word Hasidism or Hasidic, when it refers to particularly Orthodox Jewish congregations. But the main word that's used for saint is kadosh, which means holy. That's the word that Isaiah uses when he has his religious experience in the temple and sees the cherubim and the coal touches his mouth. He says, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Kadosh, kadosh, kadosh." In Greek, the word that's translated saint or saints or a saint is hagios, which also means holy. St. Paul uses that word, that concept of holiness, to refer to all members of the church. When he writes his epistles to the churches either that he founded or that he was going to visit, he writes to the saints in Philippi, to the saints in Corinth, to the saints in Rome, etc. It takes in everyone in that idea of holiness. Pretty soon, though, there seemed to be a need to recognize special people, people who in some ways were set apart and had a special kind of holiness. And the word saint became more associated with them than with the general membership in the body of Christ. First were the martyrs. Those who sacrificed their life for the faith, who were thrown into the Roman arenas to be mauled by wild beasts for the entertainment of the Romans, or they were crucified along the highways as a warning to others. Later on, there were official persecutions that killed hundreds, thousands maybe, of Christians. It was a traumatic experience for those who remained. I'm sure they had a kind of survival's guilt. I'm sure they wanted desperately for these deaths to not be in vain. And so they saw the martyrs as holy, as saints. The word martyr means witness in Greek. But these were also hagios, holy people. It was holiness that they were witnessing to, and that was honored. The church also came to honor famous people that way, the apostles, people who began churches, the writers of the Gospels, whether they were killed or not. Our St. James is named after the first Christian martyr, James the son of Zebedee. We know about the martyrdom of Stephen, the deacon, who was stoned to death while Paul, then known as Saul, was sitting and watching the mob. So the idea of saints grew to include popes, to include legendary figures in a way, and always was a special display, special witness of holiness. The idea of saints, the word of saints, the concept of sainthood also came to be used in missionary efforts by the church. As the church expanded into formerly pagan areas, very often the church would appropriate, repackage the local pagan gods and present them as saints. They would use the same symbols, they would use the same feasts and ideas that went along with these former pagan deities, and who were now saints of Christ, saints of the church. examples of that are, well, Christmas was the date for Christmas was set because that was the festival of the sun god, the birth of the sun, around the solstice time. We know in Mexico that vision of the Virgin of Guadalupe that was so important in the Spanish finally connecting their faith to the indigenous people. That vision occurred on a hill that had been dedicated previously to the Aztec moon goddess. And of course there's Halloween, right? Halloween, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, Dia de los Muertos. These were pre-Christian festivals. Celtic mostly, I think our tradition comes. And this time when the dead were honored, when the membrane between the worlds was thinnest, was celebrated for a long, long time, millennia, and brought into the church through the idea of saints. So sainthood became an important idea, institution. For local people, they had patron saints. You had patron saints for your naming day. Soon, this idea evolved, though, to where the saints were not only displayers of a special faith or important figures in the church, but also morally perfect. They were seen as special. They had a unique connection with God. They were different from us. Originally, God was seen as personal and relatable. He walked in the garden with Adam. He came to Sarah and Abraham's tent, bargained with Abraham over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the original story of Jacob wrestling, he wrestles with Jacob and renames him Israel, he who wrestles with God. But soon that intimacy became awkward and uncomfortable. God was seen as so awesomely, overwhelming holy that you really dared not approach him. The people at the foot of the mountain told Moses, "Don't let us see God, we'll die." It was too much. By the time of Jesus, you couldn't say the name of God, you couldn't say the Spirit of God. The temple was referred to as the place where God's name dwelt, and only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, the dwelling place for that name, once a year. It was so set apart. So the idea that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us brought that intimacy back to God in Jesus. And that was a central point of the early Christian faith and why it evolved into doctrines that associate Jesus with deity. That evolution also meant that Jesus became more and more awesome, distant, unapproachable. And that was the place where the saints came in. You could go to the saints. You knew them. There were lots of them. They had special jobs. You could talk with them. You could pray. The church asked people to pray through the saints. You could go on pilgrimages dedicated to the holy places that were made holy by the saints. You could give a contribution to the church and help build the St. Peter's or some other missionary activity. We're sending out our pledge letters this month, later, by the way. All these ways of connecting with God through the saints reached a culmination in the idea of treasury of merit. It was thought that saints, being perfect, being morally perfect, didn't really need all their merit that they'd accumulated that could get them out of purgatory, get them into heaven. And so people, by praying, by going on pilgrimages, by contributing, could draw for themselves on that treasury of merit. That evolved over centuries. It's a highly abusable idea. It was at the core of the early Protestant Reformation, at the center of Martin Luther's teaching in Germany, and resulted in a diminution, in a way, of sainthood and vicarious credit. And I agree with that. I don't think that just because Chris Schwantz is particularly holy, I can borrow some of her holiness to get out of my problems. We don't look at things that way. We see things differently, but I don't think that means we should throw out the idea of sainthood. I think we just need to recontextualize it. We're in a different culture, we use a different language, we believe different things, but there is, we affirm as Christians, a dimension of holiness that is the source of all things in God the Father, that is the Word made flesh in the life of Jesus, and is also expressed in the lives of people that particularly touch us with their holiness. And we can see through their lives, in a way, the holiness of God and learn from that. We're back to St. Paul, because we all share in that call to holiness, that call to sainthood. We just don't recognize it. In the world, we're distracted, we're self-centered. St. Paul says, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now we see as if in a dim mirror, a darkened mirror, and you can't make out things. Because what happens is you look in the mirror and what you see is your own reflection. And so often when we are thinking that we're involved with contemplating God, contemplating Jesus, thinking about the saints, looking at what that means for us, we read into it what we already believe, like looking at a mirror. But mirrors in those days weren't like mirrors now. They weren't fully coated on the back. You could kind of see through them. That's why Paul calls it a dark glass, a dim mirror. And so if we look at Jesus, if we look at the saints through this dark glass, we can begin to see the light. We can begin to see the holiness. We can begin to see the charm of holiness and bring that light into our lives, into the world. It's not as if the holiness isn't there all the time. It is. We just need to understand it. It's like, those optical illusion drawings, not illusion really, but like where there's both a young woman and an old woman in the picture, and you don't see it right away, but then you can see it. You see the difference. Or there's an hourglass, that you see the hourglass, but then you notice that it also is a picture of two people looking at each other. It takes a while to see it, but once you've seen it, you can recognize it. You see it right away every time you look at the picture. And that dim mirror looks like that. Once you see it and look past your own reflection, you find that special something that the Hebrews found awesome, that the disciples were drawn to in Jesus, and that people have found in saints throughout the ages. We're in a different culture, a modern culture, but that holiness is still available. And the point is to not focus on the saints, not to focus on Jesus necessarily, but to listen to what they teach, see how they were examples of people who were in true connection with God, and were able to bring the power and the healing of that connection into their own lives and share it with others. And we are called to do the same. We're called to see the light and be the light. We're called to follow the saints, but not necessarily emulate them, but to find the holiness within ourselves and begin to bring that. That's what Paul meant by calling the whole church of saints. And that's what I think our calling is as well. We become saints. God is in the process of making us saints through all of this, through all of our experience. Discovering the sainthood that's there all the time and has been there all the time. For all the saints. God from God, light from light. Sainthood illuminates and shows us the truth. And we are sent to light the world. Thanks be to God.